In my experience, I have found that once users discover how to use the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions, they rely heavily and almost entirely on those two functions. Do not get me wrong, both functions have their values and uses. However, they can be expanded and improved upon with some additional functions that are at our fingertips. One of the most important functions for using these other lookup functions is the match function, so let's learn about how to use it. The match function's parameters look very similar to our VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions. There is a lookup value, a lookup array, and a match type. The lookup value is the same concept as for our other functions, as this is the value that you want to find. The lookup array, rather than being a full table, is a single row or a single column worth of data that contains the item that you want to search for. Finally, the match type is very similar to the lookup range optional parameter true or false from our VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions, except that it has three options which I'll cover in detail later in this lesson after we've learned how to use the function normally. The match function works just a little bit differently from our two lookup functions. Rather than returning the item that we're looking for, it tells us where in a list our item exists. So for example, if I had a list of fruits that had apples, cherries, grapes, and watermelons in that order, and asked you where in the list grapes was, you would tell me that it was the third entry. That's exactly what the match function does. For an Excel-oriented example, I'll use the same sheet from before with the percentage completed tables. If I do the match on my 33.33% value, select the percentage completed from either of my tables, and use a match type of 0, I can see that it is the third item in both lists. Initially, this does not sound like a particularly useful function. What good is it to know where an item resides in a list if you can just see the list? Well, let's go back to our summary where we're looking up zoos and animals. If you remember here, we're using VLOOKUP to search for the animal name, and then we have the value of 2 to get us to zoo number 1 with our column index. If we change our zoo dropdown to number 4, our formula still attempts to get zoo number 1, and so we'd have to change our formula from having a 2 column index to a 5. Now what exactly do the 2 and 5 represent? Well, they represent the position in the list in which these zoo values exist. With that in mind, I can replace the 2 with the match function. I can search for the zoo number within a lookup array that consists of the data example sheet range A4 to AA4. The result is a single lookup function that will update whenever I select a different animal or zoo value. Using the match function in this way also makes our lookups more durable. You might have thought to yourself, since zoo name is simply a number, what if I just used that number in my lookup? I could add 1 to it and my lookup would work every time. In this instance, you would be correct, so let's quickly create that form of the formula. Now, however, what happens if, on my data example, I delete a column from the middle of our data set? When I do this, everything's been shifted around. Back on our Summary tab, we can quickly see that our VLOOKUP with the match function is still correct. However, if we select a zoo beyond the point where we deleted, we can quickly see that the VLOOKUP without the match function is now looking at the wrong column, since our zoo names no longer exactly correspond to each column. The match function is basically a helper function. On its own, the index provided is rarely particularly useful, but when combined with other functions it can be incredibly powerful. As you likely noticed in the match functions I've written so far, the match type value has been entered as 0 each time. For the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions, we use true and false. So why am I using 0 now? Well, the match function has 3 different options for its match type. Let's go back to the percentage lookups and see how they work. I've created another copy of the table which has the percentages ordered in descending order rather than ascending order to help with this part. If I start a match function and pause the tooltip, you can get quite a bit of information out of the helper text. There is a value of 1 which corresponds to the term less than. In addition to this, the tooltip text reads that it finds the largest value that is less than or equal to the lookup value. The lookup array must be placed in ascending order. This value is equivalent to the true value for the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP values and is the default value if you decide not to enter a match type. The 0 value with exact match indicates that it will find the first value that is exactly equal to the lookup value, and the lookup array can be in any order. This is equivalent to the false value for the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions. It will search for an exact match, and if that match is not found, then it will return an error. The -1 value for greater than reads that it will find the smallest value that is greater than or equal to the lookup value. The lookup array must be placed in descending order. This value effectively does a reverse search from the true approach of the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions. Consider where I've resorted this data in descending order. If I search for the same 50% term from the previous lesson except use a -1 value for my match, it will find the row that refers to the 66.2% data. As can be quickly seen, the match function has a more versatile application than either of the VLOOKUP or HLOOKUP functions, but it cannot be effectively used alone. It can enhance and improve the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions by making them more flexible and durable. Our next lesson will introduce the index function, which works brilliantly when paired with the match function for searching data sets for different values. Until then, try using the match function in a few different ways to help you identify where a value is within a dataset or to improve current VLOOKUP or HLOOKUP functions in your different examples.